Hello, dear listeners. Today, I'm speaking to you from beyond the grave. Just kidding. I'm still alive, but by the time you're listening to this, I won't be at the library anymore. So think of this as a parting gift that keeps on giving. Anyway, speaking of speaking from beyond the grave, today's story is pretty close to home. Literally. Because today, I'll be telling you the tale of the Headless Ghost of Malden. Let's begin. Once upon a midnight dreary, there lived in old Malden a mad scientist named Ephraim Gray. The townspeople feared Gray, and though he wasn't often seen outside of his estate, his sinister reputation preceded him across county lines. Many said he was a bitter, lonely man who was jilted in his youth and never got over the heartbreak. Some said he wasn't of this world, and that the scientific experiments he conducted in his home laboratory were actually rituals of dark magic. What everyone in town did know for sure was that he had a servant named Josiah, who would run errands for his master, scurrying between shops to gather ingredients for potions, or perhaps just for dinner. For years, the townspeople avoided Gray's land, crossing themselves if they had to pass his home. However, if it can't be said that they warmed to Josiah, it is certainly true that they grew to tolerate him. They still believed that he assisted Gray in his gruesome work and therefore must be an oddity, but everyone agreed that he seemed normal enough. Eventually, general pleasantries were exchanged with Josiah when he ventured into town. "Hello, Josiah. Strange weather today, eh?" "'Tis indeed at that, Thaddeus. I'll take some warm wood." Or, "A blessed morning to you, Josiah. Will you have your usual?" "Good morning, Benjamin. No, thank you, I'll have a pound of pork sausage instead." And then, one day, Josiah came into town with the news that Ephraim Gray had died. Many breathed a private sigh of relief as they listened to Josiah. Some felt that this news was too good to be true. Sybil Bibble, thrice widowed, and known throughout Malden for her fine needlework and excellent anadama bread, went to see her brother upon hearing of Ephraim's death, for he was the town's undertaker. She wished to offer her assistance in preparing the body, as she knew his one employee would refuse to touch the cursed corpse. But upon entering her brother Samson's rooms, she found him greatly agitated. "Well, Samson, whatever is the matter?" "I am vexed, Sybil, vexed. Josiah has just been here to discuss Gray's final resting place. He'd already purchased a crypt, that I knew. But now, Josiah has told me that the body must not be examined or embalmed before being entombed." "Well, Samson, surely Josiah is mistaken. Perhaps he misunderstood Ephraim's wishes?" I thought that must be true, but Josiah produced Gray's last will and testament, and I saw it with my own eyes. No examination or embalming of the body, and I even saw the reasoning for this absurd demand." "Whatever could it be?" "Ephraim wrote in his will that he had discovered an elixir of life. Can you imagine? And that he did not want anything to interfere with his immortality. Josiah claimed it was true, that Gray really had created this blasphemous brew. He said he had clear instructions to apply the foul stuff to Gray's body in order to forever preserve it from decay. Lord have mercy. I had come to offer you help in your work, but apparently you've less to do for this funeral than any other." Samson paced the room and harumphed his agreement with his sister. And so it was that Samson, Sybil, and Josiah met on the 2nd of November in the year of our Lord 1850 at the old burial ground, brother and sister to see Ephraim Gray onto his next life, servant to guide him on his continuation of this one. No minister in town had agreed to perform the funeral rites for the old recluse, and while Samson and Sybil were rather scandalized by this unchristian behavior, Josiah did not seem troubled at all. He insisted that a funeral service would not have been appropriate, as Ephraim would be back among them before long. Under a gray sky, Standing in a cold drizzle, the strange trio placed the deceased in his crypt and sealed it forevermore. Or, for a while at least. After that day, Samson refused to discuss the matter with anyone in town. Sybil knew he was unhappy with the way the affair had been conducted, but she admired him for honoring the dead man's wishes. She too kept the details to herself, including what Josiah had told them he was to do next. After 3 years, Josiah was to break into the crypt of his old master, to reawaken him and shepherd him back into the living world. The Gray estate was to be kept exactly as it was when its owner had slipped beyond the veil. Samson and Sybil didn't even discuss this with each other, until, that is, they learned that Josiah himself had died, and less than a year after Ephraim. The vile seed the madman had sowed would never be harvested. Samson and Sybil found solace in this, and their discussion of it seemed to loosen Samson's lips. All those months of keeping what he knew to himself ended mere hours after Josiah was laid to rest, far from the Gray crypt. He sat in the tavern, drinking ale with alarming rapidity, and told a hushed crowd of townsfolk every bit of Ephraim Gray's ungodly plot. The story became a local legend. As years blossomed and died, the tale traveled outside of Malden, making its way into surrounding towns, captivating and horrifying the God-fearing citizens of the Commonwealth. One raw October night, nearly 20 years after Josiah and Ephraim's earthly departure, a group of 4 Harvard College medical students heard of the experiments, the elixir, and the unfulfilled final wish of Malden's greatest boogeyman. So intrigued were they by this wild account that they resolved to travel to the cemetery the next night to investigate for themselves. The sky was dark, starless, as an early snowstorm readied itself to blanket Malden. Wrapped in their cloaks, with their lanterns dimmed so as not to attract attention, the students, Thomas, John, Peter, and Matthias, squinted into the darkness, trying to find what they sought. As they began to lose feeling in their extremities, the moon briefly slipped from behind a cloud and illuminated a marble-white tomb. The moon disappeared just as quickly as it had come, but not before the 4 young men saw the tall letters G-R-A-Y chiseled above the tomb's door. Hurriedly, they made their way to the structure, which seemed to glow faintly from its brief dalliance with La Lune. They managed to open the door, and all tumbled into the cold stone dome, grateful to at least be out of the biting wind. Peter and Matthias handed their lanterns to Thomas and John, who held a lantern aloft in each hand to light the coffin. Peter and Matthias pushed at the coffin lid with their shoulders until they felt it shift. They slid it aside to reveal... 2 of the lanterns went out as they hit the ground, John having dropped them in order to cover his mouth in horror. Even above the cacophony of tinny echoes within the tomb, the 4 friends' gasps were audible, as was what sounded like a 5th person's ragged breathing. For within the coffin lay the perfectly preserved body of Ephraim Gray. He could have been sleeping, and one of the men whispered that he really may have been asleep. Didn't the others see his chest rising and falling ever so slightly, and that rasping was growing louder? At that, the frightened foursome inched forward to lean over the body and see if they could detect any sign of life. Not far from the cemetery, Sybil Bibble and her brother Samson were sleeping soundly in the modest home they now shared, both middle-aged and devoid of spouse or child. Over the whistling wind there rose a chorus of screams that caused brother and sister to sit up abruptly in their beds. In their separate rooms, they pulled the blankets tightly around themselves, listening to the screaming, and each had the same thought as their faces settled into grim lines. They did not know who was screaming, but they knew, deep in their souls, why. Later, some would say that the students resealed the tomb, trapping its monstrous inhabitant inside, and fled, never to return. Others would say that the students' scientific minds had won out, and that they had decapitated Ephraim Gray, taking his head with them in the hopes of reverse engineering the elixir of life. This version of the story goes on to describe accounts of a headless ghoul wandering the cemetery, searching for that which it missed and frightening all who encountered it. Still others say that Ephraim reawakened and became irate upon seeing not Josiah, but 4 strangers, causing him to launch a vicious attack. Whichever story held the most truth, Ephraim Gray became as much a source of fear and anxiety to the people of Malden as he was when he lived. By the turn of the century, Malden had made the decision to move all those laid to rest in the old burial ground in order to make way for a highway. The men who had been hired to relocate the legion of dead worked their way through the graves before finally coming upon a marble white crypt. They pried it open and went in to collect their grisly cargo. The men had been expecting a coffin heavy with death, and so lost their grip and sent it skidding across the tomb's floor, so light it was. Perplexed, they went to pick it back up, but noticed that the lid was ajar. Curiosity overwhelmed them, so they pushed the lid aside and peered into the coffin. All the noise outside, the birds chirping, bugs buzzing, automobiles sputtering, died away, and the men were left in an almost oppressive silence. They all took a step back, then looked at each other. On the ground between them sat Ephraim Gray's coffin, open and very much empty. That concludes our story for today. It should be noted that we have never been able to find any evidence that a man named Ephraim Gray ever existed in Malden, and all of the other characters mentioned are just plain made up. All except for one, that is. And it's the character with the most made-up sounding name who actually lived in Malden. That's right, it's Sybil Bibble. She really was widowed 3 times, but she lived in Malden in the 1600s, not the 1800s, and I honestly have no idea if she was good at sewing or making Anadama bread. She had a rad name, though. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this spooky tale, and we hope you'll come back next week for another Campfire story from the Malden Public Library. In the meantime, keep it cool, my ghouls.